I'm Asger, you can ask me anything, and Charlie So Charming took the opportunity to ask me, how much is individualism contributing to the downfall of our society? Too many chiefs, not enough Indians. Will we be taken over by pronouns? Individualism in its purest form could just be described as a focus on the individual as opposed to the collective. Collectivism does have some strengths. For instance, the sense of belonging, the sense of community. And it's probably no surprise for those reasons that collectivist societies also tend to have a stronger sense of identity and cohesion. Now, one of the problems with collectivism is that behaviors are sanctioned if they lie outside a quite narrow path. Now, these sanctions can be legal, you can be thrown into jail, you can get a fine, you can be killed essentially for big transgressions, or they can be social. It's also worth noting that societies that seem to take collectivism too far tend to be less creative or not creative at all. And I actually put in my note that most societies seem to have started with collectivism, and as they gain prosperity, they seem to move towards individualism. But it occurred to me that I actually don't know if that's true. It's a little hard to evaluate for me today as a modern human in this hyper-connected world, whether that was actually the case once we go back to prehistory. If you have any insights or thoughts on that, I would love to know in the comments below. Individualism is, from my perspective at least, historically a break with the feudal system. And I want to highlight the phenomenon of private property rights here. Now, every now and then I have a friend or an acquaintance who starts criticizing some capitalist endeavor or a big company, or maybe just capitalism as a general system. And just as I'm about to chime in and agree with them, I remind myself over and over again that, hang on, private property rights really is the foundation for all of us living in a society where it's not just one or a few huge entities that own everything that the rest of us are allowed to interact with, just like what it was the case with the feudal system. Like, as soon as we open the door for private ownership, private property rights, the king or the church can no longer say, oh, this is the king's land, right? You may live here if you sow the fields and pay taxes to the king. So it's actually a really important phenomenon, and I'll probably push it even further and say, from my understanding, it lays the very foundation for what we today understand by a free society. And that's a very modern phenomenon. And again, from this arises the very possibility of self-improvement, self-creation. I'm a self-made man or woman, right? Or all these things that are very, that puts the self in the center of things. Now, we can draw some parallels back to early days of humanism. I'm not going to go into that in this video. I am actually all for self-improvement and self-exploration, as most of you will know. But here is where the problem starts. Individualism does create a much freer society with more creativity and innovation. But taken to the extreme, paradoxically, it seems to lead us to totalitarianism, or maybe rather, even in some cases, straight up fascism. Now, I know this sounds a little crazy, but hear me out. So initially, we gained the right to express our opinions freely, to embrace our individual quirks, to pursue whatever interests we may have. But as we start taking these rights for granted, we also start imposing them on others. And that creates somewhat of a paradox here. Now, let's take the personalized pronouns as an example, as Charlie mentioned in the original question. Now, if I had met someone 20 years ago who looked like a man, who talked like a man, who sounded like a man, who presented like a man in all ways possible, but who told me that he actually preferred to be referred to as she or her in the case of the pronouns, I think I would have found that fascinating, and I would have definitely taken the opportunity to ask this person, why on earth do you have this desire? What led you to feeling this way? So I would have actually probably thought this was a positive, especially if he didn't mind that I inquired about his reasons for this preference without him judging me. Now, this is very different from the scenario we're seeing today. Today, individuals demand that the whole world accommodate their preferences, even when they're not present. And that is what creates a paradox in an individualistic society, because that's where that individual's preferences, that individual's rights to have that preference, starts infringing on my preferences. So their individualism, their rights to self-expression and thought freedom, if you will, infringes on my rights to live according to my preferences. And that is actually a problem for freedom in some sense, or definitely a problem for an individualistic society, because the individualistic society is the very basis upon which we can even logically ask someone else to actually tell them, hey, do you mind using these special pronouns? That is my preference. Okay, cool. See you around, right? You can. I'm actually kind of on board with that, right? But I am not on board with a scenario where other people's preferences infringe on my preferences and force my hand. And one thing is forcing my hands, or my tongue rather, in terms of how I speak, but sometimes it even feels as if there are strong coercion, let's call it that, to also direct my thinking. And if we take this logic even further, we also see people demanding that certain topics must be avoided altogether because they can pose a perceived harming of other individuals merely by bringing them up. We could call that vicarious individualism. That is, people take it upon themselves to advocate for others that they're not directly associated with because they assume their preferences. Okay, but hang on. Is this even individualism? I'm actually going to suggest that instead of seeing this collectivism, individualism phenomenon as two opposite poles on a linear scale, left-right, we should probably rather try to see it as a type of circle. So in this model, there's always a tension between collectivism and individualism. And if none of them are reined in, they'll end in sheer tyranny. Individualism could end in tyranny because technically, in a highly individualistic capitalist society, I could buy half the world, poison the rivers and seas, play loud music all day long, 24/7, and just pollute everything, right? Make it insufferable and intolerable for everyone else. That would be my individualist right? Now, examples of collectivist societies that take things too far, we could look to China, their Cultural Revolution, the Great Leap Forward, essentially a scenario where the state owns everything and dictates what everyone must do, when they must do it, and what they must and can think. And it actually seems to me that both these ideologies, for some reason that we don't quite understand, lead to similar, very dark dystopian destinations if we allow them to. So just to look at my helpless drawing again, I think the society we should try to strive to live in is situated in the range between the two. To me, that's the healthy territory, where the individual still has rights and freedoms, but also certain responsibilities, which also allows us to reap some of the benefits of social cohesion. Whew, well, that was a very short take on a very complex topic, and I really feel like it invites all sorts of other explorations. For instance, has there actually been a rise in individualism? And also, is individualism the same as egotism? And if not, how are they related? And what are the consequences of all these thoughts for freedom of speech? And what is the sweet spot for freedom of speech? I feel like I haven't quite addressed the too many chiefs, not enough Indians question yet. I don't actually worry so much about that. I think it's a very valid question and one that I asked myself a little while back. But it seems to me that even though we can't all be successful entrepreneurs and CEOs of Fortune 500 companies or all these big aspirations, we can't all be film stars or major influencers or billionaires. It's just literally impossible for all of us to do that. I don't think it's a major risk, because at the end of the day, I don't actually think most people are willing to pay the price that you have to pay in order to pursue those types of things. So, and again, I might be proven wrong in that department, but I think it's more fruitful probably to look at individualism and or egotism and maybe even narcissism too. Anyways, I want to thank you for the question. Great question, very interesting and hard to answer actually. And just as a reminder, my name is Asger. You can ask me anything, and please do so in the comments below. Thanks for listening. Have a good one. Cheers.